So, but we are running out of time, so I immediately keep on now handing over to Paula Marcelino, to my colleague at the University of São Paulo, and also to my dear colleague from São Paulo, from Campinas, from Amapá, Artionka Capiberibe, who is joining us from the US, and I'm very, very, very happy to welcome you two here. I'm sorry about the delay, but it's always like this when we start a conference. Thanks, yes?
Thanks, Freya. Hello, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the first conference, our first keynote, my dear colleague, like Freya, Artionka Capiberibe. Me, I'm Paula Marcelino. I'm professor in the same department of Freya, Department of Sociology at the University of São Paulo. Artionka will speak for more or less 35 minutes, and then we will have 20 minutes for questions. Those who wish to ask questions for Artionka, please write your names in the chat. Questions must be asked in English, please, like all the event. Before Artionka starts, I would like to make a brief introduction to our guest. Artionka Capiberibe is professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Campinas. In graduate studies...
Sorry, anthropology.
In graduate studies, she works in the research lines like ethnology, anthropology, and ethnology of knowledge, and studies on cultural heritage and social memory. The Artionka's PhD is in social anthropology from the National Museum link.
So I would keep on saying that, Artionka, it's a pleasure. I will just finish Paula's presentation. As far as I accompany your trajectory, you studied at Museu Nacional, which is a very prominent institution of, as we say in Brazil, not only anthropology, but specifically what we here in Brazil call ethnology, which is actually anthropology applied to indigenous peoples here in Brazil. And Artionka is a professor of anthropology at the State University of Campinas, and works a lot on not only indigenous populations, but more recently, she has been developing precisely research on the women anthropologists who, like her, and prior to her, went to the field to study indigenous peoples in Brazil. So I'm really, really very happy, and Artionka, to hand over to you as the first keynote of our conference. Sorry, Paula, I just kept on talking because many thanks, Paula. You enter afterwards. I don't know whether Artionka wants to add anything to this presentation.
Yes. Thank you, Freya. Sorry, my problem with the internet. So
no problem.
Thank you, Freya. Thank you, Paula, for the presentation, for the invitation to be here in this amazing event. And I will like also to thanks the organization of the event for being here, and and hoping that we can have a good and interesting conversation about the theme of women anthropologists in the field with indigenous peoples in Brazil, past and present. I'm going to talk here mainly about 4 generations of women who work or have worked with indigenous peoples in Brazil and in the lowlands in the South American lowland. A first generation who did fieldwork between the 50s and the 60s, a second generation which started its fieldwork between the 70s and the 80s, and which is the main trainer of the following generations, a third generation in which I am included, that began its research in the 90s and in the first decade of the 2000 years, and the most recent generation, which began its research in the second decade of the 2000 years. But before going into the subject of this presentation, I need to talk about the current political situation of the indigenous peoples in Brazil, because it seems to me that it makes no sense to talk about anthropological work with indigenous peoples without exposing the difficulties they are facing, without acting within my field of action to try to change the tragic political situation that presents itself today for the indigenous peoples in Brazil. This is a lesson that comes from my precursors in this field, from the women anthropologists that I am going to talk about here. And also in this field, science always goes hand in hand with politics. To talk about the current indigenous context in Brazil, I think it's important to start by presenting some basic data. About demography, the numbers are outdated since the Bolsonaro government didn't carry out the census in 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and due to negligence and ill will, allowed the census to be carried out only this year, exactly now, during the election period. Finally, the numbers that we have available are those of 2010, which indicate an indigenous population of approximately 900,000 people. This is certainly out of date. With just a glance at the figures from the three censuses of the indigenous population done so far, we can see a jump in population growth between 91 and 2000. Next slide, please. It must be said that this vertiginous increase in the indigenous population in the last 10 years of the 20th century is directly related to the gain in rights that occurred in this period, fundamentally with the approval of the chapter called On the Indigenous Peoples of the Federal Constitution of '88, which in short recognizes the self-determination of indigenous peoples and guarantees their right to land, driving the process of demarcation of indigenous lands throughout the country. The demarcation of indigenous lands is a long administrative process that involves several technical and bureaucratic steps under the responsibility of the indigenous agency called FUNAI, the National Indian Foundation. Next slide, please. Today, there are 487 indigenous lands in Brazil that have been demarcated and homologated, that is, whose legal status as indigenous land has reached the end of the process, and that will be, in theory, guaranteed. But as we will see here, the threats of these lands are constant. This threat is remarkable when we look at the comparative table of the number of indigenous lands demarcated since the Constitution of '88. The table shows a decrease. Please, next slide. A decrease in the demarcations, which would be normal if this indicated that the needs are being met. However, the reason of this decrease is different. Since the government of center-left President Dilma Rousseff, pressure from various economic sectors with a strong support in the National Congress began to stop the demarcation processes. And in 2016, with the institutional coup that overthrew Rousseff, what we see is a change in government policy with regard to indigenous lands. The zero declarated lands in the Bolsonaro government are eloquent, as we can see in the slide. At this moment, the extension of demarcated indigenous lands is 13.8% of the national territory. It seems a lot, but it's important to remember that the indigenous people make their living from these lands. Their lives depends on the water from the rivers, on the land for planting, and on the hunting territories. In addition, the indigenous lands are still the territories where the vegetation cover is the most preserved, which makes them fundamental spaces for the control of global warming, and with this, they render a service to all of us. Finally, these lands are most concentrated in the Amazon region. Next slide, please. There is one more aspect that I would like to reinforce with regard to the legal process concerning indigenous lands. The juridical process is a way to legally guarantee those lands, but it does not change the fact that those lands do not need to have been demarcated to be considered indigenous, because the Brazilian Constitution recognizes the indigenous people's original right to those lands, or, as the Brazilian jurist Carlos Mares points out, what in fact the Constitution recognizes to the indigenous people by guaranteeing the right to land. Next slide, please. I quote him, is the right to them to be a people and consequently the obligation of the state to demarcate their lands. There is in the threats and attacks experienced today by the indigenous peoples in Brazil a structural question. This question presents itself in the form of a repetitive political action that is carried out in the practice of granting territorial rights claimed by indigenous people with one hand and trying to take them away or not carry them out with the other hand. So the ideology that underlies this practice of giving and taking is based on a way of conserving the land as something to be poorly exploited. The way this ideology manifests itself in practice is that of politics as a war, an expression I borrow from Achille Mbembe's text on necropolitics. Treating indigenous peoples as enemies, the politics as war suppresses lives, deforests, destroy an entire epistemological and existential universe, giving sequence to an eternal colonizing project, which today is conducted by enterprises such as the agribusiness, mining, and governmental projects designated as economic and social development. Allied to this enterprise are gold miners, land grabbers, loggers, drug and wildlife traffickers, and militias, organizations of gunmen who act from the outskirts of the state, but with the leniency and, in many cases, the direct participation of the state itself. In the practical action of these subjects and enterprises, they use as their arsenal firearms, tractors to demolish indigenous people's houses, pesticides sprayed on the villages, the pollution and destruction of the forests and rivers, the enticement of indigenous leaders, rape and prostitution of indigenous women, among other crimes. Such practices consummate the dispute occurred in the realm of the laws. When looking at the trajectory of the women anthropologists who have done and are still done research with indigenous peoples, it is possible to see that although the current political context is terrible, this is not an unprecedented situation. So, and with that, I close the contextualization, indicating to you to seek information about the numbers of violence in two main sources. Next slide, please. In the reports about violence in the countryside produced by Pastoral Land Commission, an organization linked to the National Conference of Brazilian Bishops, and in the reports on the violence against indigenous peoples in Brazil, produced by Indigenous Missionary Council, another Catholic organization, also linked to the National Conference of Bishops of Brazil. Now, to address more directly the topic of this keynote, I will again have to do some contextualization, this time about the history of ethnological research among indigenous peoples in Brazil and in the South American lowlands. But now I will be more briefly. The fieldwork of the renowned anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss in the early 30s in the Brazilian hinterland has an important place in the myth of origin of the research with indigenous peoples in Brazil. Next, please. Next slide. However, Lévi-Strauss' brief stay among the Capiberibe and Caingang of the state of Paraná, among the Bororo, Pareci, and Nambiquara living in the state of Mato Grosso, and among the Tupi, Cauaribe, and Mondé of the Amazonian region of Rondônia is not the initial landmark of the research done in a systematized way in the realities of indigenous peoples. This will start mainly between the 50s and 60s. Next slide, please. Having been strongly driven in the 60s by three projects: comparative studies of indigenous societies in Brazil, areas of interethnic friction, both of them coordinated by Professor Roberto Cardoso de Oliveira, and the Harvard Central Brazil Research Project, coordinated by Professor Cardoso de Oliveira and David Maber-Lewis, under an agreement between Harvard University and the Museu Nacional of Rio de Janeiro. Another landmark moment in the history of indigenous ethnological research occurred in the mid to late 70s. Next slide, please. With a woman, the anthropologist Joanna Overing, standing out. Overing coordinated the symposium Social Time and Social Space in Lowland South American Societies at the International Congress of Americanists held in Paris in 1976, and then organized the publication of the 26 texts that resulted from the presentations made at the symposium, texts that were built on extensive fieldwork. In this publication, Overing compiled in two short texts the main methodological and theoretical discussions held at the Congress, which sought to deal with the Americanist context using theoretical tools appropriated for this region, thus moving away from the Africanist models in force at the time. This discussion will become a paradigm to later studies. Besides this, another work would also become paradigmatic for the field of indigenous ethnology. The text written by Anthony Seeger, Roberto da Mata, and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, The Construction of the Person in Indigenous Societies. That's its title. This text was also the product of a symposium, the Symposium Ethnological Research in Brazil, which took place in 1978 at the Museu Nacional in Rio de Janeiro. It is in this framework that the research of the first generation of women anthropologists focused on indigenous peoples will take place. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, I will speak here of 4 generations of women anthropologists in a time span of about 7 decades. Next slide, please. I do not take this generation as succeeding each other chronologically because they coexist for long periods. Moreover, my intention is not simply to recall the history of these generations of women anthropologists, but on the one hand, to show the methodological structure of these researches, that is, what does not fall apart with time, and on the other hand, to show the changes in the research methodology of this area, that is, what has been affected by the passage of time. In the methodological structure of fieldwork with indigenous peoples, there is something that crosses all generations of women anthropologists, but that is also common to research done by men. The use of the method proposed by anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski in the 20s of the last century, known as participatory observation, by which long periods of fieldwork are assumed. Although men and women adopt this method, there are marked differences in the ways in which these fields are experienced. This shows up in the comparison between the men's and women's accounts of their fieldwork. To address this, I will make use here of the following materials: an interview conducted by myself and anthropologist Oyara Bonilla in 2007 with the French anthropologist Simone Dreyfus about her professional trajectory, and interviews published in scientific journals with male and female anthropologists who are now references in the indigenous ethnological studies. About my own research now, I will let it apart because it's not finished and it's not published yet. Simone Dreyfus is one of the representatives of the first generation of women anthropologists who did fieldwork in Brazil. She went to the Kayapoku Benkankren in 1955. Next slide, please. In the interview, she gave us 5 aspects stand out, mainly because they are present in one way or another in the trajectories of the women of the 4 generations treated here. Next slide, please. 1, the infrastructure difficulties in reaching the research places, many of which could only be reached by plane. This difficulty will present itself most strongly in the first 2 generations, and we will see why. 2, the absolute necessity of conducting research in the native language of the people one is working with, which is also a theme more present in the first 2 generations. 3, the difficulties in making fieldwork compatible with long periods away from the children. This aspect is common to all generations of women anthropologists. 4. The longevity of work with a single people. And 5. The militancy in favor of indigenous peoples, a theme that crosses generations, but whose intensity varies depending on the political conjuncture. I will highlight some parts of Simone Dreyfus' interview in which these aspects appear. About her going to the Cubencan crane, Simone tells the following. Next slide, please. When I arrived, I was extremely well received by Darcy, and I worked for a while in the Indian Museum. I stayed waiting in Rio to be able to live in the Brazilian Air Force plane. When I arrived in the Caiapó Cubencan Crane village in 1955, they had been pacified, as they said in Brazil at the time, 3 years before. I stayed almost the whole year with the Cubencan crane. Darcy had said to me gently, "You are lucky, because this is a truly brand new contact." In this excerpt, we see that for Dreyfus to reach the Caiapó, she needed access to a Brazilian Air Force plane. Complementing this information is the fact that there were no roads leading to this village. In the excerpt also appears the extended field period, 1 year. And finally, that the Caiapó Cubencan crane were a people with, I call, truly brand new contact. As anthropologist Darcy Ribeiro puts it, the brand new contact meant that they were a monolingual people, and therefore the research could only be done by learning the language. Later on, you will understand why I am stressing the language issue. Dreyfus' research among the Caiapó resulted in a monograph with emphasis on musicology and kinship. But after this experience, she migrated to historical studies on the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean region and the Guyanas. When asked why she changed her research topic, the anthropologist told us, next slide, please. When I went to the Cubencan crane, I already had a daughter. Then I had a son, and I began to feel that I couldn't lead a life as a field researcher. I got married twice, and I didn't want to be away all the time. My husband was not an ethnologist. I came to the conclusion that I should look for a way of working that would not impose long periods of time in the field on me. End of quote. Living far from where she was conducting fieldwork and the extended duration of this research imposed on the anthropologist the need to change her research topic. In the account of the women anthropologists who live in Brazil, that is closer to the location of their research, one always observes arrangements to accommodate the situation of being mothers, something that is not mentioned in the interviews of the male anthropologists. In the women's reports, a strategy that recurrently appears is that of leaving the children in the care of their mothers and, in some cases, in the care of their husbands. The other, less common, is that of taking the children to the research site. In an interview with anthropologist Alcida Rita Ramos, a researcher who I include in the first generation of women to conduct fieldwork with indigenous peoples, and who is one of the trainers of subsequent generations of researchers, several of these elements mentioned in the Dreyfus interview appear. But unlike this anthropologist, Ramos exemplifies the situation of long-lived work with a single people, having started her fieldwork among the Sanuma subgroup of the Yanomami in 1968 and remaining in contact with them until the present. Let us see what she says of her arrival in this subgroup. Next slide, please. My choice of field was a choice made by two people because I was with Ken Taylor, my husband at the time, and it was necessary to do an extended field research for our PhD. We arrived, got down there at the airstrip and gave ourselves up to the Sanuma. And it was a real surrender. This is not rhetoric. We were at their mercy. First was the language. I stayed for about 5 months just for that, without asking many ethnographic questions. The questions were basically related to survival and not to the research itself. After that time, I started to test my knowledge and the possibility of being understood and understanding. Here again, end of the quote. Here again, the personal and linguistic issues appear. The linguistic situation dictates the pace of the research. Because of the Yanomami monolingualism, the research takes longer, since it was absolutely necessary to learn the language. It's a kind of obvious. Lastly, I briefly present a third example of this first generation of women anthropologists, the trajectory of Lux Vidal, who is the trainer of more than one subsequent generation. Vidal's trajectory will help me demonstrate a crucial difference that presents itself for fieldwork methodology as of the third generation of women researchers. Lux Vidal, after 20 years of research among the Kayapó Xikrin, who lives in the state of Pará, at the time monolingual and not very numerous, consisting of about 100 people, began a new study in the early 90s, this time in the region of the lower Oyapock River, is a region in the Guianas, where 4 indigenous peoples live: the Palicur, the Galibi Maruorno, the Caripuna, and the Galibi Kalina. These peoples have a population of about 5,000 individuals, have a long story of contact with non-indigenous people, and speak 3 to 4 different languages, including Portuguese and French. 2 of them speak Creole, a language derived from French. Of French origin, Vidal was fascinated by the familiarity with the Creole spoken by the people of this region, and above all, by the possibility of starting a new field of research without having to learn a language from scratch. Her move to Lower Oyapock helped in the realization of several anthropological research projects in the region, among them my own. Now, I will explain why, throughout this talk, I have placed so much emphasis on the importance of language. Because the field that will present itself to the third generation researchers is a field in which learning an indigenous language will become less urgent due to the fact that there are more and more Portuguese-speaking indigenous peoples. This is due in part to the expansion of the schooling processes in the villages, which occurred with the greater formalization of indigenous school education since the indigenous curricular parameters elaborated in the mid-90s. But it is also due to the greater proximity to the urban centers, either because cities and economic enterprises have been advancing toward indigenous lands, or because the closer contact of indigenous peoples with urban centers has created consumption needs that have taken them more frequently to the cities. The image of a fieldwork in a remote place of difficult access and difficult communication is becoming less frequent, especially after the advent of the internet, which is present mainly due to school education in many villages and is part of the everyday life of a lot of indigenous peoples. To close the presentation, I will talk about two more points: the political militancy of women anthropologists and also about the fourth generation. In the interviews of Simone Dreyfus, Alcida Ramos, and Lux Vidal, different forms of militant action in defense of indigenous rights or in support of projects to valorize indigenous knowledge appear. This type of engagement is common to all generations of researchers and occurs in different ways. Some of these researchers were responsible for making anthropological reports for the demarcation of indigenous lands. Others conceived, together with the indigenous peoples with whom they worked, projects for the economic sustainability of these peoples. Still others were active in publicizing the violent situation they witnessed in the field. In a broader timeline, we observe difference in these actions related to the political conjuncture. During the period of military dictatorship in Brazil, from 64 to 85, the first generations worked hard to garner international support to avoid true situations of genocide. With the re-democratization, efforts focused on guaranteeing the rights of indigenous peoples, which was done mainly by the construction of the chapter on indigenous peoples in the Federal Constitution of '88. In the last 13 years, the pressures on indigenous peoples have once again increased, and with the extreme right-wing government of Jair Bolsonaro, they have reached their peak. But now it is indigenous peoples themselves who are taking the lead in the denunciations and mobilizations against violence towards them. The anthropologists act as partners in this fight. Here, I turn to my last theme of the presentation, the fourth generation of women anthropologists in the field, the presence of anthropological research by women among indigenous peoples. On this point, I will highlight three aspects. The first is that for about 10 years now, the process of systematizing field research among indigenous peoples has become increasingly normatized and controlled. Today, besides the authorization of the National Indian Foundation to enter an indigenous land, it is not possible to do field work without submitting your project to the approval of the people involved and to the approval of the National Commission of Ethics in Research based in the Ministry of Health. The second aspect that distinguishes this generation is that a gendered cutout will appear both in the formulation of research projects and in the development of field work. Issues surrounding women and the feminine become increasingly recurrent, and it becomes more difficult to produce generalized reflections from specific points of view, such as that of a male leader of a given people. This is in stark contrast to previous generation, with some exceptions, of course, in which the all-encompassing male voice was dominant, as the issue of gender in the indigenous people was not even raised in this for both male and female anthropologists. And the third aspect about the research of the fourth generation, and with this I will close this presentation, concerns the fact that it is in this generation that research by indigenous women anthropologists appears, and that they will begin to occupy spaces previously reserved for non-indigenous people, such as positions as university professors, advisors to indigenous organizations, art curators, among others. These indigenous anthropologists also begin to question assumptions established in anthropology, and because of their condition as women, also in their own villages and communities. This is what we see in the interview given to the anthropologists Oyara Bonilla and Bruna Franqueto by the indigenous anthropologists Nelly Marubo and Sandra Benitez. I quote here an excerpt from Nelly's account. The next slide, please. As a little girl, my father sent me to study in the city with the priests. For him, it was enough for me to learn to read and write, then I would become a teacher or a nursing assistant in the village. It was not foreseen that I would enter a university. He wanted me to be a leader because he didn't have a male child. Since I was the one who was learning the situation of two societies, for him, I would be a spokesperson. One day, I came home at 9 and the women were there. They wanted to talk to me. I felt like running away. They asked for my help. Anthropologists tell everything wrong. We are the authors of our own stories, and we want you to tell it the way we tell it to you, and that you put it down on paper. This request from the women was stronger. End of quote. Nelly, whose PhD research is focused on her own people, the Marubo, although she would like to research anthropologists in the same way they research indigenous peoples, exposes the challenge that anthropology has posed to her, letting us foresee by her condition as a woman anthropologist and by the questioning that she presents to anthropology, that the research of women anthropologists in the field with indigenous peoples in Brazil has entered a new methodological turn. And with this, I close. Thank you.
Thank you, Artionka. Sorry, guys, for my connection issues. Unbelievable that, no? Thank you, Artionka, for your kindly accepting our invitation. And we have some minutes to questions. If everyone wants to make a question to Artionka, please. It's necessary only to open your microphone and put the question. Henrique, please, Henrique.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'd like to ask a question to Professor Artionka about her lecture. In the case of these women anthropologists, did their contact with diverse concepts and experiences of gender from these indigenous communities informed or impact their own interpretations of their fieldwork?
Sorry, if you are asking if the gender question appears because of the contact with non-indigenous situation, I don't think I understood the question.
If the contact of the women anthropologists you are referring to with diverse conceptions and experiences of gender from these indigenous communities, so the Yanomami experience of gender or other experiences of gender were important for their own understandings as of their work as women anthropologists in the field?
Well, it depends on the generation, in fact. Yeah, because in the first generation, the research was made all in a generic and trying to encompass all the society, and the internal division were exposed, but not problematized, and I think it happened in other fields from the anthropology area. And when as the time goes by, the questions about gender became more and more strong, and we needed to face this question. But there is another women anthropologist called Vanessa Lee, and she worked about difference of gender in the indigenous, in the Kayapo people, where she did his field work. But it was before the raise of the question about gender. So even the terms used, even the expression used to discuss this theme were not very well established. I don't know if I answer your question, but I think it's a little bit from this way. Maybe, okay, thank you.
Freya, you are mute. Okay.
I think if Khushbu Jain wants to make a question, I will pose a question first. And then I ask mine, okay?
Okay.
Thanks, Freya. This is very interesting. Thank you for a very fascinating presentation. And I was just thinking it in the contemporary times that, and specifically relating to the previous question by Henrique, because as a middle-class urban woman from urban castes, upper caste society in India, I actually understood feminism and feminist politics the most while working with the homeless people. And I just wrote to Freya how during the course of my intensive fieldwork, I separated from my husband. So family, again, continues to be the central focus for ethnographers, and the balancing continues to be a challenge for women as they're working in any other field. But working with the indigenous groups, this was a very fascinating question to me, and I think it calls for an interesting study further as to how the ethnographers' own personal lives have been affected by working with the indigenous community. That I think is something really fascinating we could dwell on further. Thank you.
Thank you, Kisobo.
I think when we are engaged in this field, but because the term is engaged, we are not doing work and passively work. The lives of the people with whom we are working became very important to us, and we are enrolled in a kind of political project to help them to have access to different to rights, to their lands, and so on. And I think you are thinking she's crazy, she's not answering the question, but this is important for understanding why the women anthropologists, in spite of having issues about their personal lives, engage themselves in the research, and they do a lot of arrangements for continuing the research, and the research which is also the engagement. Both things are together all the time. So is this, and I think that the exposition of this kind of issue is important, because there is a kind of myth in anthropology surrounding the long time field work, a kind of myth of being heroic to stay far away from the family and so on. And this is not true. This is not true. This is an engagement. This is very serious. This need to be considered also. We need to be honest with our students about the difficulties of being away, being far from home, and also about the happiness and the joy of experiencing a kind of situation very, sometimes very, very joyful. I don't find another word. So I don't know if I answer your question, but it's a little bit. And about feminism, maybe it's a part of the question of Enrique. In the contemporary generation, and mostly in the indigenous women anthropologists, this is a very huge question. They are discussing a lot about feminism and putting questions for the feminist movement. And they said, well, we don't like to be apart from the life of our husband, because our life is collective in some situations, not all. In indigenous ethnology, we have difficulties to generalize the situation, because there are very different. There are people who have long time of contact with non-Indigenous people, so they are closer to the way of life of non-Indigenous people, and other people that don't have much experience with a non-Indigenous way of life. But they, in some situations, they say, "Oh, we don't want to be apart from our husband. Our lives is a collective life, and we are all integrated in this relations, the relations between different generations, between women and men are very important. So we don't think separate the social world separately as you think." So there are a lot of questions in this issue.
We have 6 minutes. I think the Freya's question, it will be the last. Please, Freya.
No, thanks, Paula, and thanks, Artionka, for this really very exciting talk. I just wanted to, it's more a comment than a question, but just to, I think what your keynote very well shows, if we consider your keynote from the point of view of spatial sociology, is the reach, the spatial reach of this women anthropologists' action in the professional action, because not only them, but you too. So you have to address the private space of your own family or your own personal life. You have to, at the same time, you have to be present in the field and with women, and we know that from research in these areas, mainly in the lowlands, that you have the kind of there are also specific spaces for women in these spaces. But you also have to really talk and so on. There are also men spaces you have to address, and specifically, which I think is also a third, at least third or fourth space, is the political space. So the public space of the public debate, and which is a very male space in Brazil, in such a macho and misogynist society. So I think you have to, what your research shows in a very, very well, is really this kind of versatility these women have to have, and you have to have. Yes, I think this, so I'm just making a little bit of a lobby for this kind of spatial methods approach to your research, because I think you could really, this versatility does not only have to do with the relations, the different relations and situations, but the spaces they have to cover as a female, as a woman anthropologist. So if you want to react, feel free. It's just
I think the last sorry, the word is the account of Nelly shows a little bit this. She went to the city to study, to become a nurse, an assistant of nurse or teacher, but she was the only female child of her father, and so he projects on her a kind of leadership. And in the same time, the women of her society also did this, and she was troubled by all this expectation on her, but she go further. So in this moment, we saw a very strong participation of women as leaders, as political leaders in the indigenous movement. I can say some names and in different areas. So this space, which was male centered in the past, it's not centered by, it's not dominated by men now. We if you accompany, if you see the campaign now, you will see there is Sonia Guajajara, candidate to the Congress, and she was in the last election candidate as a vice president in one main party in Brazil, and there is Célia Chacriabá. I can say some names. Simone Caripuna, a lot of women. It's very impressive how the situation changed in the last 10 years. In the moment, and and for finishing, as we are out of time, and I related this to the urgence of protecting the land, and the image and the idea that they spread is that the land is the mother of everything. And so this image of mother, it's a woman, and it's the image of a woman, and they go to the front to protect and to fight against all the destruction, because of the lives of their children, of their parents, of they have a real they are very engaged, and so they in this movement they allowed to have more and more space in the political action. Is this?
Thank you so much, Artionka. Again, we thank all you people for your presence,